The question of what rights really are is a question that has many answers, almost none of which really get to the core of the issue. However, before we can get to a correct understanding, it is necessary to understand more common understandings and why they are wrong. However, before this can be done, it is first necessary to delineate out the different kinds of things that might be referred to as rights. A common framework that is used for this purpose is the distinction between positive and negative liberties as developed by Isaiah Berlin in his 1958 lecture entitled Two Concepts of Liberty. Negative liberty is typically summed up as freedom from. Berlin describes it in the following way. One is said to be free to the degree to which no human being interferes with my activity. It describes the zones of one's life in which others are not allowed to interfere. This is where the classical liberal emphasis on the distinction between the public and private spheres comes from. One is free to speak as long as their speech is not plotting of a murder. One is free to practice their religion as long as it does not lead to them to sacrifice virgins to the volcano god.
You got this, butthole.
Ow! Hey, this is religious persecution.
This is the perspective of liberty used by most classical liberals and libertarians. The rights enumerated in the First and Second Amendment are examples of negative rights. One is entitled to free speech because the government is not allowed to stop them from speaking, not because the government is obliged to help someone express their opinions if they are otherwise not able to. The Second Amendment says that people are allowed to have guns. It does not say that people are entitled to them. The Lockean conception of the state of nature and how it ended is best understood through this lens as well. In Locke's conception of the state of nature, everyone is free to do everything they want. However, it becomes apparent that there are some rights for which it is better for everyone to just give up their own rights to prevent others from exercising their equivalent rights. That the rights to murder, pillage, and steal are worth giving up so that others don't have the same rights. It's in regards to you. The social contract can be understood as the precise line of rights at which rights are worth keeping and which are worth giving up. The state strictly built on this conception of rights is often referred to as a night watchman state, a term originally coined by socialists to mock this conception but later embraced by those who buy into it. Positive liberty, on the other hand, is often nutshelled as freedom to. Berlin described it as derived from the wish on the part of the individual to be his own master. It is the ability to be one's own master. This is the view of rights expressed by progressives and socialists when they say that things such as food or healthcare are human rights. Berlin connects this conception back to the writings of Kant and Rousseau, who said, "He is truly free who desires what he can perform, and does what he desires." The biggest criticism of this view comes from the fact that unlike negative liberties, for which the demand on everyone else is that something is not done, for example, the right to life, as understood by Locke, means that no one is allowed to murder me. Positive rights demand something actively from the rest of society. For example, the right to healthcare, which might in a positive right framework be viewed as an extension to the aforementioned right to life, means that if one cannot get a hold of healthcare, then that is a violation of their rights, and the state is required to get them healthcare. While this intervention is likely to begin with payment, there is nothing to stop this intervention from becoming coercive if it cannot be secured voluntarily. There is an additional problem with positive rights, which is the question of what they should aim for. Is reason the ultimate goal, as someone like Hegel says, or is there some romanticized path, such as someone like Carlyle would propose? The issue of coercion proves to be decisive in the attempt to find historical societies built on positive rights framework. Societies are rarely able to produce enough. The best examples of this working are Nordic model countries with vast welfare systems. However, this only works because of the fact that these countries have extremely high trust levels such that few people actually try to take the shit, and thus the system does not collapse under its own weight. In societies of extremely low trust, positive rights-based frameworks lead to totalitarian regimes in which the state has to grow to make up for the fact that the system cannot possibly work. This describes the history of most Marxist regimes. However, there is a third approach, which is to limit the scope of citizenship and have either a slave or serf class do all of the work. This is a relatively common system throughout human history and can be seen in states such as democratic Athens or the antebellum Tidewater South, which were both societies with an extremely wealthy citizen class supported by a slave class. Isaiah Berlin's work is popular because it identifies two parallel traditions both existing within the liberal canon. In doing so, it essentially preempted the modern discourse about the lies of liberalism all the way back in 1958 by saying that there are two liberal traditions using the same terms and that communism is only an endpoint for one of them.
So the reason that communism haunts liberalism is because they both operate on the same promise. One one thing that liberalism promises is a return to what it conceives of being the original human state, right? Which is humanity living with a perfect set of rights that are endowed by nature, and these things are lost when you enter into a society. And early liberal thinkers, I mean, you begin with like Thomas Hobbes, who says, well, you just give them all up. You don't have any rights, but that's the price you pay for security. Then you had John Locke, who said, well, no, if we're making the state, we can make it so we give up some of our rights, but in exchange for security over this domain, but the rest we've got free. And then you end up with Rousseau saying, well, no, you give up all of your rights, but in exchange you get given a suite of rights, which are called civil rights, not natural rights, by the state. And therefore, and that's where you end up with sort of positive right to broadband or food or housing and, things that actually are outside of the human being. And so this line of thought has kind of incrementally and chronologically developed. And communism is just an extension of that line of thought, because the problem the liberal has is they say, well, look, we came into society to protect our property because, of course, in the state of nature, the property is insecure, and you have complete freedom and complete equality. And that's a good reason to have the state. And the liberal says, yeah, so we're going to have the state that protects our property. We're going to give up some rights, for example, the right to plunder someone else's property in exchange for the protection of our property. But then if you get to the Rousseauian position where we're exchanging our rights for the rights of someone else so we can better live in this state of nature, the communist says, yeah, but in the state of nature, you don't have property. And if you're trying to get back to the state of nature, so everyone's equally free and equally equal, then you have to give up the property as well. And that's true. Okay. And the liberal says, I do want equality and I do want freedom, and the very root of inequality is property. So the liberal is already committed to the premise that the communist is just advancing towards them, because the liberal has made this argument. It's like, no, we should all have the same. We should all be the same, and we should all be equally free. And the communist says, well, why did you stop with bourgeois freedom? Because the bourgeoisie will be able to own the property, but the proletariat won't own the property. And so you're creating an inequality. So it's inevitable that the proletariat will eventually overthrow the bourgeoisie in order to get rid of everyone's property. So we return to that position of being equally free and completely equal.
Since Berlin delivered his two concepts of liberty speech, the debate on the nature of rights has persisted. Andrew Wilson is a popular right-wing debate bro, and like most debate bros, he wins not by being correct, but instead by knowing how to disingenuously frame issues such that he cannot lose, regardless of how incorrect he is. One of his signature positions for this purpose is the claim that rights are power.
Protections are not real. Rights that as we know them, are just things that we recognize as things of value to us. So for instance, I usually define it as simply, you have a right to speak freely. If you're in the middle of the woods and you're buck naked, you can say whatever you want. You have a right to keep and bear arms. Pick up a stick, sharpen it, pointy stick, you can defend yourself. Ain't no one going to stop you. The question is, when you get into conflict with someone else, where is that line drawn? So the reality is, rights are recognized as things that we can and must do to survive and maximize potential.
I think rights are force, and I think that...
You think rights are force?
Government
rights
protections.
What do you mean
rights
are force?
You're talking about government protections.
No, I'm talking about period. I'll explain what I mean. A right, to me, is an entitlement absent duty. That's a right. Okay? You're entitled to it, but you have no duty.
What does that mean?
It means that you have it... So, like, okay...
Entitlement to speak.
Yeah, so if you have a right to own a gun...
To speak.
No, hang on, let me finish. If you have a right to own a gun, do you have a duty to own a gun?
But do you have a duty to speak?
No, you don't have a duty to speak.
If you have a right to vote, do you have a duty to vote?
So it would be an entitlement.
That's your argument.
It's an entitlement,
but
absent a duty.
But you can speak.
Yeah, you can.
And so
until you can't,
the question
until somebody stops you with force.
So you're talking about government restrictions are made up by us as a people.
Just people can adhere to your rights without any form of government. If you're walking down the street and you speak, and a guy turns around and smacks you in the mouth and breaks your jaw, right? He has now used force against whatever this right you think you have to speak. You have no right to do shit except whatever you can enforce. Right. Your mechanism is force, and the mechanism against you is force.
And so
all rights are is force.
You're talking about government protections, not rights.
No, I'm talking about rights. What is a right?
So it is an intrinsic moral function.
Well, okay. Intrinsic meaning what?
It means if again, I'll try to explain. If you're born and you live in the middle of the woods, there are things you can do. You can hunt for food, you can defend yourself, you can speak freely. Now, what we've done in the United States
Unless
is
you're born blind and you can't talk, right? Then where does your right to speak come from?
you lack the ability to speak,
Right.
but you still have the means by which you are allowed to do it.
Yeah, but what makes it an intrinsic right to be able to do? Like, where does this idea come from other than you axiomatically kind of just
Evolution?
say because I can do something, I have the right to do something?
It's part of a evolutionary biological structure
So
that
if I-
resulted in the survival of humanity.
So if I like grab a spear and I can stab somebody with it, I have a right to?
No, that's
Why?
that's attacking
different.
somebody. That's
Yeah,
violating.
but other
that's a
than
whole
an
bunch-
axiom of you shouldn't do that because I just don't feel like you should, what makes it intrinsic that I don't do that?
that you don't go and kill another person.
Yeah.
So the way I view rights would be things that and again, there's a debate over what rights are.
Yeah, let's start with that. What are they?
No. So there, it's honestly difficult to define,
Yeah.
but it is certain moral structures or.
I would
things
say
that are-
axioms. Would you agree with that? Just an axiom. So, like, you have inalienable rights from God according to the Constitution. This is an axiomatic principle. It means this is our like philosophical starting point is that we have these.
I would put it as things that were required or greatly beneficial to the survival of an individual that we greatly benefit.
I agree.
Right,
I agree. We
it's-
benefit. I just don't know what makes them intrinsic or like you're born with them or something like this, other than we just kind of agree to it.
So I think the restrictions we kind of agree to. And some people might view some things as rights and other things not as rights. Like the left thinks healthcare is a human right, which makes literally no sense.
No sense.
But in terms of your ability to speak, you can walk around, you can speak. To defend yourself, you can pick up a stick, you can defend
But
yourself.
this goes back to the same argument. I can grab a spear and murder somebody. I can do that. Why don't I have a right to do that?
Because you are now causing harm to another person, which is a detriment.
But why
to
is that valuable?
human-
Why are other people valuable?
Yeah, well, why would that be an intrinsic value? So, like, I can
One
envision
would
a
result in the
planet,
end of
for
humanity, and
instance-
one results in the expansion of humanity.
Well, no, both can result in the expansion of humanity.
Right, but absolutely not. You're completely wrong.
No, I'm completely right.
You are wrong.
In the clip just shown, Wilson fully commits to the positive view of rights while Tim Pool takes the side of negative rights without having the understanding to defend them properly. Wilson's argument consists of little more than redefining the word right in such a way he wins the debate by default. However, Tim's poor defense does not mean that his position is untenable, just that he did not know how to articulate it, and that Wilson was not willing to give him the charity to be able to flesh out the position. If Tim had had a better understanding of political theory, he would have said something like the following. Rights are narratives about the proper use of force, which can only be sustained if force is willing to constrain itself in accordance with them. That framing would have addressed Wilson's central contention in a manner that would make Wilson look obviously absurd if he continued to use his definition. Earlier I mentioned how understanding of Berlin's work effectively addresses contention that liberalism necessarily leads to something like Marxism. People who make this argument typically point to some expectation of equality found in a writer like Rousseau. However, the framework delineated by Berlin shows how there are two parallel traditions that need to be conflated in order to make this argument. A positive conception of rights does tend to lead to something like communism because it states that people are entitled to some bare minimum standard of living without pointing to a standard from which one can rigorously define the said standard. The negative conception of rights defines rights only in terms of what people are not allowed to do to each other. For this reason, the standard has a hard standard to which it can inflate the scope of rights. Despite being 68 years old, Two Concepts of Liberty seems to eliminate aspects of modern political discourse that are not well articulated by anyone engaging in the discourse now. It shows how a large amount of confusion is caused by the relation of two parallel traditions, both masquerading under the same name, which people tend to either reject entirely or accept while being oblivious to the contradiction of doing so.